Hello and welcome to the programme which brings together some of the UK's leading columnists with foreign correspondents who write for the folks back home with the Dateline, London. This week, is this the beginning of the end for Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister? And is this the end of the beginning for a Brexit deal? With me are Jonathan Sacerdoti, a political commentator and broadcaster in the UK, Geoffrey Kofman, Canadian-born broadcaster, Miriam Margaronis, who writes for The Nation and has charted the effects of Greece's financial crisis, has made radio documentaries on migrants journeying from Africa to Europe, and Yasmin Alibhai-Brown. Born in Uganda, her family was one of thousands expelled by Idi Amin, and she's now a British newspaper columnist. A warm welcome to all of you. Good to have you back with us. Now, Israel's newspaper front pages this weekend are not the ones Benjamin Netanyahu was probably expecting. After the second indecisive election in just 5 months, power is described as slipping away. Himself alone and political death spasms are among the headlines. Prime Minister for the last 10 years, with a 3-year stint before that in the 1990s, Mr Netanyahu has been reduced to urging Benny Gantz, the ex-army chief who leads the newish centrist party Blue and White, the largest in the Knesset after Tuesday's poll, to join a unity government. Gantz told him to push off. This in a week when Iran, a country the Israeli Prime Minister regularly invokes in elections as a reason why it needs a strong government, was blamed by the United States for halving Saudi oil production with 2 drone attacks claimed by Houthi rebels in neighbouring Yemen. Let's, before we talk about all of that, Jonathan, just talk about Benjamin Netanyahu's fate. President Rivlin starts the consultations on Sunday with the different party leaders about who they think should be Prime Minister, might be in a position to form a coalition government. But do you think we are now witnessing the end of the Netanyahu era?
We definitely could be witnessing the end of the Netanyahu era, but we also may not be. And I think it's important at this stage that we think about it in that way, because Netanyahu hasn't done as well as he would have hoped. These elections were elections he didn't want. Avigdor Lieberman, who's now the kingmaker, effectively pulled out from his government to trigger the first round of elections and then refused to join his coalition when he did manage to win in April. But now I think it's definitely not looking good for him. That said, he has proven that he's still a smart player when it comes to negotiations for forming a coalition. He managed immediately to get all the other right-wing parties and religious parties to agree to sign a document that says that he will negotiate in coalition talks on their behalf. And that puts him in a slightly stronger position, because that means that effectively he has a bloc of 55 behind him and you need 61 to form the coalition. And if we take every party on face value in their system in Israel, with all of these different smaller parties playing the balance, there's a problem, because so far nobody will sit with somebody, and if you put together all the equation of who people won't sit with, there is no potential to have a solid coalition. And that's why this idea of a unity government's come about. But for that to happen, certain people won't sit with the Arab list parties because they're so extreme. Certain people won't sit with the ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties because they're extreme in a different way. And various people have said they won't sit in a coalition with Benjamin Netanyahu as the Prime Minister, even if they sit with Likud, his party. And that means that someone is going to have to wobble and break their promise, and that will be where we find the coalition. And that could still be Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition.
You don't envy President Rivlin, really, do you, in having to kind of deal with the politics?
It's so complicated. It is so utterly. But I have to be honest, I look forward to the day when he goes, because he has been, I just think he's been such bad news. It's taken him to really bring deep pessimism to that area, almost irrecoverable pessimism. And I think that's a tragedy. People don't even talk about a two-state solution anymore. He's taken away some hope, and I can never forgive him for that. So I hope it's not him, whoever it is.
Would Benny Gantz-led government be very different or much better? I mean, it seems to me the campaign has been largely about who can be tougher on the Palestinians.
Well, yes and no, I think, because a lot of Palestinians are already saying, at least we know the devil in Netanyahu. We don't know what, and the campaign has all been about expanding territory, which
and this new party did appear almost from nowhere back at the time of the last election.
But I still think the presence of this particular individual, taking into account all the up and down of politics in Israel and Palestine, has been considerably destructive.
I think that's one of the interesting things about Netanyahu, is that we hear that sort of thing a lot from outside Israel, and then we look inside Israel and he still does very well, which is quite hard for a politician after as long as he's been in power. And I think part of the reason for that is the elections weren't really about occupying territories or about those sorts of issues. He's always been Mr. Security, so sure, that plays a part. But on the other hand, he brought Israel into the OECD. He's brought a certain amount of economic success to the country. He has kept relative peace within the country. He's held very few wars during that time in comparison to Israel's history. He has defended well against the terror threat on several fronts. He stood up against Obama, who for 8 years was a very critical president of the US against Israel. He took Israel through to the Trump administration era, and he's now got very close ties with Trump.
Well,
he's
that's
got
the problem,
close
isn't it?
ties with Saudi
That's the
Arabia
problem.
under the radar, with Egypt, with other countries.
Let's be clear.
The Israelis see that as well, I think.
His desire to survive seems less about Israel itself and more about him. And this is a man who's facing serious bribery and corruption charges. And if he
Which
is
he's
able,
denied, of course,
which he
but as you say,
denies,
they are being pursued by
but
the
if he
authorities.
is able to stay in office, there is the possibility of immunity. And so for him, this is not just about his legacy continuing. It is about protecting himself from potential serious consequences.
And one must
of course.
not forget, I know it becomes so normative, but what's been happening in Gaza in the last 3 or 4 years is unspeakable.
It is true that
It's
Gaza launching rockets into
unspeakable,
Israel
and we are not
is
talking about it
unspeakable.
here, partly because of this ridiculous definition that was forced upon us that we may not discuss some
But
issues.
Yasmin, come on.
No,
the problem
no,
with
it's
Gaza
awful.
is not one-sided. You have a terror-led population who are under the thumb of Hamas, which is
But you don't punish
sponsored-
the people.
and
You don't shoot
Islamic jihad.
12-year-olds.
And I think
the
that the
problem is-
situation with Gaza is not simply one of one side or another.
Would
It's a
there be-
question
No.
of terror
But listen,
tunnels, of
just-
rockets, and
The
that's why
humiliation-
Bring
Israelis
it
do
back
want
to the
defend from
election.
that.
I think, to yank this conversation back to where we began, I think, to me, what is interesting is that in an era where we wonder whether democracy can withstand the kind of assaults that we're seeing in the U.S. and some of the gamesmanship we're seeing here at Westminster, it's really, I think we can take some comfort to know that, in fact, pendulums in democracy do swing, and there is a resilience in the Israeli system that says Netanyahu, for all of his aggressive gaming of the system and his attempts to hold on to power, and the extremism that he articulated in the last weeks of the campaign, is not actually able to do this. And whether or not he survives, the fact that we see this possibility of change, to me, is a sign of optimism in really what is a sea of anxiety in democratic countries.
But in the kind of wider picture, unless there is a settlement, a just settlement for the Palestinians, both Israel and the Palestinians face a future much like the past or worse. And if we have both potential prime ministers, that is Netanyahu and Gantz, both promising to annex the Jordan Valley, the Area C of the West Bank, which makes a two-state solution extremely difficult because it is the main agricultural area for the Palestinians. Where does that leave us?
I think that's perfectly valid analysis, and I would also say, though, that one of the main reasons that there hasn't been a Palestinian state yet has been the continued refusal on the behalf of the Palestinians to form one when they've been offered one at every stage. So I think that this deadlock in that process is one that's caused Israelis to prioritise other things in elections like the ones we've just seen.
I think that where it leaves us is where we are. I think that the sobering reality is that no one is invested enough in a resolution to this conflict that we're going to see it change in the next number of decades, probably.
Just
I think
as
we're
we
going
had in the last 70
Yeah,
years.
I think it's going
Just
to
in
muddle
terms-
on like this with flare-ups of tension, potential, more deaths and intermittent wars.
Can I just come back? The annexation is not a kind of side product of what's going on. It is an ambition, and it is an ambition that they are pushing, and the world is allowing this to happen.
Is that just electoral politics? do you
No,
think,
I
playing
don't
to
think
an
so.
audience?
No, I don't
Okay.
think so.
Let's
It's
just-
been going on for a long time, and the criticism has vanished, actually, of
from
this
the rest
ambition.
of the world.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the other country that Jonathan mentioned in the context of that. You were talking about Benjamin Netanyahu's success in building relations with countries like Saudi Arabia below the wire. We hear this announcement this weekend that US troops are heading to the region. There have been these consultations between Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, and Mohammed bin Salman. in Saudi Arabia. The Crown Prince effectively runs the country now. Jeffrey, what's your take on this, coming as it does after last weekend's attacks on the Saudi
I think, listen, I think that the interesting thing about watching Donald Trump is that we know he's a schoolyard bully, and we know, like every bully, he likes to threaten and brandish his weapons. But I think ultimately the thing we're seeing about Trump is that he doesn't actually want to create a confrontation. And Iran's threat that if you attack us and it's game on. I think, and this very odd comment from Trump when this happened, saying we're waiting for instructions from Saudi Arabia, which is extraordinary for a president of the United States to say. Any other president would have been demolished for this kind of thing. So I just really think that he's not going to do anything unless someone else initiates it. He has been blind to bin Salman's flaw. Yes, the Khashoggi assassination and other things. He does not want to know that, and he will do anything to maintain that relationship.
I think there is also the question that mustn't get away from us in all of this analysis as well, is of Iran. Iran is a huge regional threat, and the comments not just of Trump but also of the Iranians during this period have been deeply concerning for the world. If people are worried about Donald Trump, they ought to be much more worried about the Iranians. The Iranians have said that their response to any American action, military action, will not be constrained to the source of that action, meaning they'll spread it around.
Just on that point about Saudi Arabia and Iran, though, and BBC's Frank Gardner's, BBC's security correspondent, was saying on Saturday that Saudi Arabia does not want to get into a war with Iran. It does not see it as an attractive option. It likes to maintain this kind of standoff, but the last thing it wants is a direct confrontation. So in a sense, its position is not dissimilar from Donald Trump.
Well, I think that, generally speaking, the Iranians have said they don't want a war, but they won't blink if they have to have one. They will defend themselves. They said, certain senior figures have said they'll wipe out virtually Saudi Arabia. They've also repeatedly made threats like that around the world.
It is odd on both sides, surely, both with Trump and Iran. So we don't want to, take them seriously.
Well, one of them has a reputation of sponsoring terrorism around the world.
And so does Saudi Arabia.
No, I don't mean Saudi Arabia. I meant the States. The United States.
Yes. But one of the things is, what is the meaning of the departure of John Bolton?
As National Security Advisor to Donald Trump.
I've not been able to...
Is there a meaning?
There must be, because he was a hawk, wasn't he?
I think it's important to note again the timing of these alleged Iranian strikes. And if we agree that it probably was Iran that did this in Saudi Arabia to the oil facilities, coming so soon after John Bolton left, it seems very much a game of chess. They're saying, your hawk has left, you've made it clear you're not going to do very much, so now we can do this. Well, Trump is somebody who doesn't want war. He came to power and he came
doesn't
to office
want
with
people
that.
who disagree with him.
Exactly.
But to go back to the two powers, absolutely, Iran and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, what's going on in Saudi Arabia is so shocking, what is being done to their own people by the governments in both countries. The executions, the imprisonments, the human rights violations. And it wasn't just Khashoggi. I mean, there's a report Helena Kennedy wrote this year.
The British QC.
Yeah, on the number of executions this year alone in Saudi Arabia, including 6 children.
But in the context of Iran and Saudi Arabian tensions, what do you do? Iran's hardly got a white record on these issues as well, has it?
The executions in Iran are just as bad. So, and it's all, I have to make my feminist point, these are all men. Actually, all vile, awful men in these countries, in America, in our country, who are actually taking us step by step towards a catastrophe.
I think, especially given that yesterday we had millions of people, especially children and young people.
This was on Friday.
On Friday, yes. We had massive protests around the world about the climate catastrophe. And so we haven't mentioned that little 3-letter word, oil. And it just seems to me that this is a moment where we just have to recognise that oil is not only destroying the planet, but it is the cause of, and has been the cause of, terrible wars, terrible conflict. And this is a moment to really grasp that and say we have to shift away.
One last
Well
word.
And I think
Well said,
there's
well
one other
said.
thing which is important to note. We're sitting here in London, and I think Iran has been extraordinarily aggressive in recent weeks and months towards the UK. I'm talking about the imprisonment of UK nationals or co-UK Australian nationals,
British Iranian,
tourists, British
those that were
Iranians,
US Iranian.
the seizure of the Stena Impero, the behaviour with the Iranian tanker that was released from Gibraltar, and on a pledge from the Iranians that it wouldn't be going to Syria to sell oil, which is exactly what it did. The Iranians have lied. They've developed secret nuclear weapons. They've imprisoned British nationals. It's strange that Britain actually isn't perhaps positioning itself in a slightly more serious stance against Iran.
Something
at
else
the
is
moment.
distracting the country.
It's funny you should say that, Geoffrey, because the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg is perhaps one of the smallest of Europe's countries, just 2,500 kilometres of land, bordered by Belgium, France and Germany. It has a reputation for being both wealthy and a little dull. On Monday, though, it was so noisy with anti-Brexit protesters, I think that might be the thing that Geoffrey was thinking about, that Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, decided not to stay to be heckled in the sunshine at what should have been a joint news conference with the Grand Duchy's Prime Minister. Yet after the Luxembourgeois President of the EU Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, gave an interview to British television on Thursday, the pre-Brexit gloom seemed to lighten. We can have a deal, he declared. By Friday, Mr Johnson's Brexit secretary was in Brussels talking with the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier. Maria, sterling rose to, I think, a 2-year high just on the back of this Jean-Claude Juncker announcement. Could it be, whisper it softly, that we might be heading towards a Brexit deal?
Well, a lot of people are making a lot of money on these currency fluctuations, so that's one thing to just put in brackets there. I have no idea if we're moving towards a Brexit deal. I mean, you know, Juncker has since, Barnier has since said that the proposals put forward are not concrete, that there's only these non-papers and this and that. But I think the important thing is that this bubble of media discourse about Brexit has now moved so far away from the reality of what's happening in this country, as has the politics. And both major parties, Labour and the Conservatives, are tearing themselves apart. Labour this morning has been on Saturday morning, has been in this tremendous row over the Deputy Leader, Tom Watson.
Which is sort of somehow connected to Brexit.
It is connected to Brexit, but all these rows within these parties go back a long way. And I just keep longing for some political leader to come out and say, look, this Brexit thing it's become a metaphor for everything else that's gone wrong, for austerity, for poverty, for people's feeling of having no agency in politics, of being disenfranchised, for all of that, and we are barking
Geoffrey,
up.
it should be a 4-letter word rather than a 6-letter.
Yeah.
I feel like we've seen this possibility of hope before with Theresa May. How many times did we sit around this table and talk about maybe she's going to pull the rabbit out of the hat?
Many times.
And so I'm very skeptical. I think that, maybe, but I think what this is really about are all sides posturing so that whatever the outcome on October 31st, they're not accused of not trying, and I think it's about it's about seeing to be trying. Maybe it's true. Maybe brinksmanship will actually result in something.
There's another part of the calculation. The word deal is going to put off all those supporters of the Brexit Party.
Have you
Brexit
noticed
Party
they're now
does
saying
not want a deal.
WTO exit?
The Brexit Party does not want a deal. They've said it.
What
They
Farage
want
has
a
said,
no-deal exit.
What Farage has said, I believe, is that he wants a deal, but just removing the backstop isn't enough, that the deal needs to remove
he said
the
he
European
wants a
Court
no-deal.
input, and he would prefer no deal to Theresa May's minus the backstop. I think there's a big difference.
The word deal is connected to May. Boris cannot say this is deal minus, deal May plus, May minus. And the threat that he fears most, the Brexit Party, will only intensify. So I don't know what happens next, but I think there's an election coming. And I don't know who
But he doesn't
to
control
vote for
that,
anymore.
though. I mean, this is the thing. He doesn't control that decision, does he? Because under parliamentary rules...
Under that ridiculous Fixed-Term Parliament Act, what we now end up with, and this is a prime example of why legislation should never be made to satisfy one coalition, because we're now stuck in a position with a Prime Minister who's lost the tiny majority that he could have had. He now has a majority of minus 40-something, trapped in office by a Labour Labour Party...
I love the way you said he lost it, as it was an accident.
Yes.
I mean, he did sort
he
of
cut it off.
Okay,
Cut off his own arm, let's say. Let's put it that way. Left with a leader of the opposition who this week, a couple of days ago, polled the lowest ever approval rating for the leader of the opposition since Ipsos Mori started polling that. So we now have a position that the opposition can trap in office a prime minister who can't actually govern.
So what does he do? Like a banana
One
republic,
second.
he shuts
One
down
second.
Parliament?
One second. And that he's now stuck in this position where the country is the one that will suffer because there's no government to be able to make laws on anything, never mind Brexit. There's an opposition who won't allow a general election for the people to even choose because presumably they're afraid of leaving or don't want to have to deal with the mess themselves. And this fixed time, and then once they've let him show himself to be a disaster, then they'll grant him one. But then they should take office and perhaps make sure they can come up with something better.
Perhaps the first thing he can do is stop shutting down Parliament when it doesn't suit him.
But
that is such an authoritarian decision he took, and he lied. I'm sorry, he lied about why he took that decision.
Well, the government says he didn't.
Which government? Of course they say that he didn't. Of course they say he didn't. But, you know, to have this happen to the oldest democracy in the world. I've just been in Africa, and they were saying to me, our leaders are going to follow Boris Johnson.
I think one of the interesting things that's happening with the Boris Johnson prime ministership, I think, is he's increasingly trying to prove that he can bring about no deal in order, he says, to bring about a better deal in negotiations. And if that's true, what's happened is Parliament has constantly removed from him his biggest threat, which is the no deal. And in order to maintain that threat, he's had to toe this line of intentional ambiguity over whether he'll break the law. Of course he won't. Over whether he'll prorogue again. Of course he won't. But he wants the EU.
Really?
He wants the EU, I believe.
It's an awfully dangerous game.
Very dangerous.
I mean, it's
but
driving
he's
to the
been
edge of the cliff and saying...
high-risk stakes because he's got nothing left. His plan was to go to get a better deal with a credible threat and then come back with the better deal. Perhaps also he would have gone for the no deal if he hadn't got it, and that's another discussion. But in order to have that threat sound incredible, he's now got to allow them to believe that he'll break the law, that he'll end up in prison, that he'll go against the Supreme Court, that he'll prorogue again. These are the things he's desperately clinging to. And somehow or other, he is making people believe he'll do it, which is terrifying.
Maria is not so confident.
Well, do you actually believe anything he says?
Exactly.
Some of it. He's a politician, so I take most of it with a pinch of salt.
Of course. But this policy of brinkmanship, which is, I mean, it is extremely dangerous, and I think it's totally counterproductive because one thing that all these...
But the EU is doing it too.
Well, not exactly.
Well,
because,
the deal is
because
unmovable.
the thing
We can't
the
open
thing
it for
that-
discussions,
the thing
and
that
they have done.
most of the government are not pointing out is that even if we have what they are now euphemistically calling a WTO exit, which means no deal, we still have to negotiate a relationship with our closest trading partners, which becomes increasingly difficult and is catastrophic for this country.
Jeffrey, I think this is probably the right week to ask you this. Is there anything you want to tell us about your teenage years in Canada? Did you ever apply dark makeup on your way to
Justin Trudeau. I think this is... The thing about this is that it is a long time ago and it is an absolutely inexcusable act of stupidity and insensitivity. But Canada's in the midst of an election, October 21st. He has a chance of holding on to at least a minority. The Conservatives are very weak, and the leader is not getting traction. But the third party, the New Democratic Party, has collapsed its vote, and so he was poised to at least possibly hold on. This has come at a very odd time, and methinks maybe somebody's gaming the system to do this.
It's not that long ago, is it? He was 29. I mean, he's not such an old
man. 20
now.
years ago.
Okay.
No.
Was it acceptable 20 years ago to back up a party?
Don't ask me to defend him.
I tell you what I think the problem is that many people say that the incredulity is a bit fake and it's for political reasons. Yeah. Perhaps it is. Yeah. But certainly once looks like youthful indiscretion, 3 times looks like a hobby.
Absolutely.
And I think that if he weren't the king of woke, who'd built much of his political posturing on being so woke, perhaps there wouldn't be such a big
woke
deal.
For those.
I think if you look it up in the dictionary, you'll find a picture of Justin Trudeau. I'm not sure which colour the picture will be, though.
Listen, the question is this going to affect... I mean, apart from the fact that he's an idiot for having done it, will this affect the outcome of the election on October 21st? And the sense that I'm getting from Canada is that no, that this is not going to undermine him. That his record as Prime Minister oddly goes right against those photos, which is why it's so hard to
Apart from the
reconcile the two.
allegation of putting pressure on the then Attorney General over not taking action against companies,
You know,
that did cause
but you know, again, that's a more nuanced issue. The alleged corruption in that case, because he was, you know, on one level trying to protect one of Canada's largest employers from collapsing. So, you know, I think that this is a man whose reputation in Canada is for compassion and tolerance, which is why these photos are just so disconnected.
I've talked
as
to
the
quite
only
a-
African
Yeah, well,
member on this
I
panel.
can't get exercised about this brown face thing because all my white friends go to tanning salons and want to look like me, so I take it as a compliment. But the thing is, a lot of my Asian friends who are Canadians, by Asian I mean the way we use it,
Yes.
Indian, Pakistani,
Indian,
of my
South Asian origin, right.
are all behind him. They love the man. They absolutely love the man.
I wouldn't say that even his supporters universally love him. There is a bit of a kind of, oh, come on, Justin, amongst many of his supporters. But I think, you know, in the Canadian papers today are saying that people are simply not going to buy this as a reason to throw him out of office. That doesn't mean he's going to win.
It could add to others, I presume, is the issue. It won't alone be enough to kick him out of office, but if you were wobbling,
absolutely. Listen,
like in all elections.
This is catastrophic and indefensible. But the timing is obviously designed to undermine him. The question is, he's got a month to recover. He's already moving on to talk about other issues. And the question is, will the voters move on?
We have only a week to recover, but we will be back with more Dateline London at the same time next week. For now, from Jeffrey, from Yasmin, from Maria, and from Jonathan, and from me, Sean Lay. Thank you for your company. Goodbye.